If I was to ask you what the first Xeno game released on a Nintendo console was, you would likely respond with Xenoblade Chronicles on the Nintendo Wii. However, Monolith would actually release their first Xeno game 4 years earlier, while still under the management of Bandai Namco. And here it is, Xenosaga I and II, a Nintendo DS remake, or should that be demake, of the first two Xenosaga games. Now, while I haven't heard much about this game due to its rather forgotten status in the series, the bits I have heard have been rather positive. A lot of Xenosaga Episode 2 detractors have praised this game for fixing the issues that they have in the second game. Meanwhile, others have praised its gameplay for being more engaging than the almost movie-like nature of the PS2 games. So let's see if this game can meet those lofty expectations as I look back on 2006's Xenosaga I and II for the Nintendo DS. Now just a reminder that the Xenosaga I and II retrospective was brought to you by my lovely patrons like Cameron Strauss and Echolocation. For as little as $3 a month, you can get your name shouted out at the start of every Xenosanctum video, as well as access to bonus behind the scenes content, link in the description below. As I said in my Xenosaga Pied Piper retrospective, following the release of Xenosaga Episode 1, the team at Monolith were very much interested in expanding the Xenosaga series into other mediums outside the core PS2 titles. This included the previously talked about games of Xenosaga Freaks and Xenosaga Pied Piper. However, arguably one of the biggest side projects was an anime adaptation of the first Xenosaga game, aptly named Xenosaga Episode 1 The Animation. Despite being a retelling of the first game's plot, the anime chose to make several deviations from the first game's story. Several of these changes were rather well received by Xeno series creator and Monolith CEO Tetsuya Takahashi, who was interested in incorporating these changes into a remake of Xenosaga Episode 1. Takahashi had been brainstorming a handheld remake for the first two Xenosaga games for about a year prior, especially after Episode 2 had not turned out how he wanted. With the anime seemingly improving the story of the first game in several ways, Takahashi decided to call on several of the developers of the anime to begin working on his remake. This included scriptwriter Yurishio Takeda, who would later go on to be one of the key writers in the Xenoblade games. Despite altering the script in numerous ways, Takahashi and Takeda made sure that the story would be narratively consistent with the then upcoming Xenosaga Episode 3. With the main Xenosaga team busy working on the third and final episode of the Xenosaga story, Takahashi would have to make do with a smaller team for his handheld remake. Thus, to help bolster their numbers, the team would bring on external game studio Tom Create to help develop the game. The team decided on the DS as their platform of choice, as the Bat and Kaitos team were also working on a DS game at the same time, and as a result both teams could share resources. Wanting to keep the large amounts of dialogue and cutscenes, it was decided to make the DS remake a 2D game, with the game only briefly using the PS2 cutscenes and a handful of scenes. Thus all the characters would now need to be redrawn in 2D. This task would fall to illustrator Hiroshi Takeuchi, who had previously worked on animes like Cowboy Bebop and My Hime. Xenosaga DS, as it would be tentatively titled, was teased to the public in late 2004, alongside Bat and Kaitos DS. While Bat and Kaitos DS's development would notably sputter out into nothing, the Xenosaga remake would be properly revealed almost a year later in September 2005. The game now had the title of Xenosaga I and II, which notably lacked the word episode, as seen in the PS2 titles. The game would finally launch in Japan on the 30th of March 2006. Despite being a remake of two games that were released in English, Xenosaga I and II would not receive an official translation. This is likely due to the small sales potential of the game, combined with the corporate shenanigans occurring with Nintendo buying Monolith from Bandai Namco. As of today, despite the large growth in the Xeno fandom, there has been any major attempt to translate this game. The user Valkyrie, who I recently interviewed, had attempted to create a full translation but has since put the project on hold. What makes the situation even more annoying is the game doesn't even have a full script translation, so you're gonna have to bear with me as I try to dive into the plot of this game. Now, I've already gone into the plots of Xenosaga Episode 1 and Episode 2 in previous retrospectives that I've linked to down below, so instead of re-explaining the plot, I'm instead going to dive into the major narrative differences between this game and the original PS2 titles. For a start, the plot now takes a much stronger focus on Shion's story, keeping the plot mostly focused on her, even into the second game's plot. As a result, plots involving other characters have mostly been moved into side chapters that the player can choose to skip over. As for Episode 1, several minor changes were made. For one, several characters from the second game now appear earlier, such as Kanan, who shows up near the end of the first game. meanwhile the Curse Washers haven't given more of a plot in the story as seen in the anime. Finally, the last small change is Momo using her bow instead of a wand as in the original first entry. Arguably, it's episode 2 which has had the bigger changes. For one, outside of Cosmos, all the characters now retain their episode 1 outfits. Several of the filler side plots have also been totally removed. The ES Zebulon also now gets a proper introduction, as opposed to just sort of showing up in the second game. Citrine also gets a more involved role in the plot. We also get to see Richard and Herman's faces in their boss fights, as opposed to just hearing their voice from outside the mech. And we also get to see Sakura die during the flashback of the URTV training, rather than occurring off screen. Alongside these changes, there's also been a bunch of smaller changes, but I don't have time to go into detail on all of them, so if you want more details on the changes, check out the Xeno wiki page in the game via the link in the description below. For the most part, Xenosaga I and II is just the original PS2 games now on the DS. Once again, you will navigate corridors of spaceships and planets as you progress through the game's insanely complicated story, made even more hard due to the lack of an English translation. While the game still has long cutscenes, they are thankfully not as long as they were in the PS2 originals, and as such the ratio between cutscenes and gameplay is now much better balanced, although it still skews too much to cutscenes if you ask me. As you explore the game's locales, you have to solve puzzles and find new items by blowing up objects scattered around the world. However, there are some major differences. Obviously, the biggest difference between this game and the PS2 entries is the fact that the game is in 2D, and I mean fully in 2D, as unlike Xenogears, we don't even have 3D backgrounds. While Xenosaga I and II is more graphically impressive than the previous Xenosaga Pied Piper, it's not exactly a brilliant showcase of what the DS can do. In-game character models are pretty basic compared to other DS RPGs, and they're not the most expressive. While the in-game models aren't too impressive, the game is nice enough to occasionally switch to larger character models in some cutscenes, as well as some artistic stills. In fact, the game even briefly reuses some of the PS2's cutscenes, which is somewhat impressive. However, a lot of the time we lack any visuals of what's happening, instead of relying on the characters explaining everything. Unfortunately, the PS2 game's cinematic cutscenes were never going to properly translate over to the DS's limited specs, and this is arguably one of the game's biggest setbacks. While you might think Xenosaga I and II locations are a one-to-one conversion of the PS2 game into 2D, that's not really the case. Maps have now been greatly altered compared to their appearances in Episode 1 and Episode 2, with most not reflecting their PS2 layouts at all. This includes the series staple of segment addresses, which are now totally absent. With segment addresses now gone, the party no longer has any reason to return back to past visited areas, as you can no longer use the UMN to encephalon dive to see previous locales. While the UMN can no longer be used to dive back to past areas, you can still receive mail like you did in Episode 1. UMN terminals also still appear across the map, although this time they no longer act as save points, as saving is now done completely off the menu. Instead, these terminals allow the party to heal as well as access minigames. Being on the DS, Xenosaga I and II is a bunch of touchscreen based minigames. From combat minigames to puzzle solving games, minigames tend to be somewhat basic, but do offer a nice change of pace from the main game, and some are in fact mandatory to even progress through the game. Going over to the game's menus, players of Xenosaga Episode 1 will feel somewhat at home, as Xenosaga I and II's progression closely resembles Episode 1's progression over Episode 2. Like Episode 1, characters once again have ether spells which they learn off a skill tree, as well as special attacks which can be upgraded and equipped to end different combos. Although now the system has been greatly simplified, with characters only having access to one set of skill points for all upgrades instead of the 3 individual points they used in Episode 1. This makes it much easier to prepare the cast for battle. Being a 2D JRPG on the DS, we've unfortunately gone back to random encounters. Thankfully, the encounter rate isn't too high. Meanwhile, once you get into a battle, you'll see a system somewhat reminiscent of Xenosaga Episode 1's combat. Like in Episode 1, characters have up to 3 bars of AC, which they can use to unleash multiple attacks. Once again, characters can perform either ranged or melee attacks as part of their first and second attack, with their third attack being a special attack which is assigned by the player themselves. By leveling up these special attacks, they can be brought forward to be used as part of the second attack, which is useful as characters will initially start with 2 bars of AC and only regain 2 AC every turn in combat. While the combo gameplay is a straight up copy from Xenosaga Episode 1, Xenosaga I and II makes several notable changes into the formation system. While you're once again restricted to a party of 3, they are no longer assigned to front and back rows, instead they are freely able to move between 3 rows and 5 columns. By moving to rows closer to the enemy, characters will trade off defense for greater attack buffs. Meanwhile, by assembling your party into select formations, you can trigger special formation bonuses which will give your party a range of stat changes, with my personal favourite being putting everyone on a column to give you 3 AC regen every turn, allowing you to unleash unlimited specials. With your party now able to move laterally, targeting has somewhat changed. While you can still conduct melee attacks from anywhere, ranged attacks must be made in the same corridor as the enemy, but have the advantage of tending to do higher damage. Like in Xenosaga Episode 1, the different combinations of melee and ranged attacks will result in different attacks with different properties that will in turn work better against some enemies over others, requiring experimentation. Outside of combo attacks, you also can once again fire off spells, as well as use items via the battle menu. We also have the return of the event slot and the boost system, which has unfortunately gone back to the individual gauges of episode 1. Whereas the enemies excessively boosting whenever they feel like also returns, which once again makes combat feel very unfair. Moving away from foot battles, once you hit the episode 2 part of the game, the characters will soon find themselves getting into ES battles. These for the most part play like beefed up versions of the on-foot battles, unlike the ES battles in the PS2 games, which normally play completely different. Like in the foot battles, you can position the ES units to attack either using melee and range attacks. Special attacks can also be performed when AC is at 3, however they now replace a basic combo rather than being the final part of one. Composer Kosuke Yamashita would be brought on to develop the soundtrack of Xenosaga I and II. Yamashita had previously worked on the Xenosaga anime, developing that show's amazing opening and ending songs. However, here his work is far from ideal. The Xenosaga I and II soundtrack is unfortunately very generic. While the pieces fit the mood of the game, they really don't stand out much, and I cannot really identify one piece that I found really stood out. Worse, the game lacks a lot of diversity in its soundtrack. While we thankfully now have multiple battle themes, we unfortunately have some extremely repetitive tracks. Mission Startup, which you're currently listening to now, is played way too much, and as a result I am kinda sick of it. In fact, excluding Xenosaga Pied Piper, I think I can call this the worst soundtrack in the series. While I still think that Xenosaga Episode 1 has the weakest soundtrack of the mainline games, it still has some incredible pieces in the cutscenes, which we sadly do not have here. Outside of the music, we don't really have much else to talk about in the sound department. While the game does have a little bit of voice acting, it's mostly limited to battle shoutouts and a few quips of dialogue. Worse, we don't even have an ending song, which, to be honest, is kind of expected with this game being on the DS. In fact, this being a DS game kinda sums up my thoughts of this game as a whole. Being able to play the entirety of Xenosaga Episode 1 and 2 on a DS was definitely a novelty that I found very intriguing. While the game no longer has the cinematic scope, it's still very much the PS2 games in terms of gameplay and progression. And while the combat adds some new features like the formation and attack types, it's still predominantly Episode 1's combat from the PS2 transferred over to the DS. However, Xenosaga 1 and 2 is definitely a game I struggled to get through. For a start, while thankfully not as tedious, Xenosaga 1 and 2's combat is a copy and paste of my least favourite combat system of the mainline Xenosaga games, and it carries a lot of those games' issues. It's also not a very good looking game. The game still has that holdover GBA look that a lot of early DS games had. Alongside the poorly aged graphics, we also don't have a very content rich game. Character customization has been greatly diminished to the point where I don't feel like I can play much around with the character setups. At the end of the day, Xenosaga 1 and 2 exists to retell the first two games' stories after Takahashi expressed disappointment at how episode 2 turned out. The game is still extremely cutscene heavy and, without a proper English translation, I could not get anything out of the game's story. As a result, the one big selling point of this game is completely lost to me, resulting in this game being nothing more than a downgraded port of the PS2 games. Hopefully in the future someone like Valkyrie can make a full English translation of this game that I can dive into and again experience the story improvements. But until then, you're going to have to deal with my rather negative review of this game. Well, we're almost done with the Xenosaga spin-off games as we only have one more to go. Finally finishing up these reviews, we dive into the game which sort of bridged the gap between Xenosaga Episode 2 and Episode 3 as we look back on Xenosaga 2 and 3, A Missing Year.